Good evening, everybody. If you could find a place, be comfortable. There, as usual, is room in the front. Now, an official good evening to everybody and a big welcome to each and every one of you. My name is Tom Haynes and I'm from the Mayflower Church Global Justice Advocacy Team.
And I'm Joe McConney with the Welcome to Stranger Ministry at St. Joan of Arc. And this is the first event we've hosted together. As most of you are aware, both of our churches are very active and committed to the central teaching of Christ's ministry, which is social justice. So we're hoping that this will be the start of a long relationship.
And one of the things that we believe as faith-based social justice organizations is that we are all children of God. Mother Teresa says it this way: no color, no religion, no nationality should come between us or divide us. And that's one of the fundamental values that drives us in everything we do, how we view immigration, how we view what's happening in Guatemala and Honduras and all over the world, and how we treat each other on the border and wherever else we are and be as human beings. And we're here tonight to challenge the narrative. If we get all of our news from the corporate media, the mainstream media, the legacy media, whatever you want to call it, those of us who are involved in this event could pretty much guarantee that that is not the whole story, nor is it even the correct story. There's a narrative that they want us to hear, and there's another narrative that we believe much more strongly. And we're here tonight to understand that narrative more deeply and hopefully carry that out into the world. And we plan to do that by learning from some very amazing speakers. We'll be introducing them later. We're thrilled to have three incredible speakers tonight. And then we're also going to be taking some action to make the world more like what we want, and from our faith traditions, more what God wants as well. And we are very, very thrilled that you have chosen to be here tonight. You'll be hearing more about Berta Caceres, the Honduran indigenous environmental activist. More tonight, you'll be hearing more about her. And one of the things that she said to those of us in the United States is she understands why it's difficult for us to be activists and to maintain the discipline of being activists because we're too comfortable. And we always have the choice of going to dinner rather than thinking about things that are sometimes some would say are not pleasant to think about. So I really, really appreciate the fact that you have chosen to come here tonight to tackle some of these issues, and that you have chosen to enter a world that many around us choose not to enter. Actually, it looks like we have the right number of chairs, and so we kind of have a filled room in this weird COVID situation. And I'm inspired already just by seeing all of your faces here, and thank you very, very much for coming here tonight.
This event is sponsored by many organizations. A special thanks to Witness for Peace and the Honduras Solidarity Network. Our speakers tonight come from those amazing organizations. We'd also like to see who has joined us tonight. So just a show of hands, who's here from Mayflower? Okay. St. Joan of Arc? Okay. Hands off Honduras, anybody? Yeah, Ken? The Solidarity Committee of the Americas? Women Against Military Madness? Okay. Anyone else? Anybody I missed? Anybody who's unaffiliated? Well, thank all of you for coming.
Just a couple of housekeeping details. You can hear the choir rehearsing upstairs, so we'll have that entertainment as we go along. We would ask you please to silence your cell phones and maybe even keep them put away, unless you're posting something on social media about this event. Then have them out, stand up, walk around, do whatever you want to do. The restrooms are just outside the door. We would ask that you use them one person at a time. We at Mayflower haven't quite figured out how that works yet, but that's how we do it here. So make sure that there's nobody else in there before you go in. And please stay socially distanced, and it looks like we're doing a good job of doing that so far. And unless you're standing up here at the microphone, please leave your mask on. To conclude our welcome of you to this place, we acknowledge that we are on land that is the current and ancestral home of the Ojibwe and the Dakota. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide, forced assimilation, and efforts to alienate the indigenous inhabitants from their territory here. We honor and respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land who have retained tribal sovereignty, treaty rights, and cultural resilience. Indigenous people are spiritual and physical caretakers of this land to which we all belong.
Well, we'd like to start tonight by finding out what your perceptions are of Central America. What comes to your mind? So let's just break into pairs or, groups of 3 for just 5 minutes and discuss what your thoughts are. What's on your mind? What brought you here tonight? We'll do this again towards the end and ask for feedback at that time, but just take about 5 minutes to talk about what brings you here tonight and what your thoughts are about Central America. All right, the narrative on Central America set by the previous administration focused essentially on the wall, detention and deportation. And many of us have tried to change that conversation to the root causes of why are they coming? Well, in essence, why are they leaving? It's the poverty, it's the violence. But tonight, we're going to take a little different angle on that and examine the role U.S. policy has played in driving migration. And our first speaker tonight is Vicky Cervantes, who's a founding member and the U.S. coordinator for the Honduran Solidarity Network in North America. Her home is Chicago, but she's appearing tonight by Zoom from Montreal. And Vicky's going to give us some historical background on U.S. intervention in Central America and the role that U.S. policy continues to play today. So, Vicky, all I'm asking you to do is to condense 70 years of U.S. intervention into 10 minutes, so that still leaves us 5 minutes for questions, okay?
Okay, thank you, Joe. Thank you so much to Mayflower and everyone. And I can't see your faces, but I'm happy to know your faces are there and that you're interested in Honduras. I think, as Joe mentioned, Honduras in particular, we hardly ever have heard about over the years. And then only recently, as the subject of a few headlines having to do with migration and violence and things usually presented disconnected. Sometimes a couple of things are connected. Well, it's violent, so then people are leaving, but always leaving out the real history and context of the situation in Honduras. And I think that without understanding that, we cannot understand what's happening now, because there's not a disconnect between the history of the U.S. and Honduras, its past history and its present history in Honduras. And the role that the U.S. plays in Honduras is inordinately powerful and with way too much influence. And it's the people who are bearing the cost. So going back, I think when you look at the history of the U.S. and Honduras, it's sort of like there's two threads that run through it. Well, first there's a key thread, and that is intervention and interference. Interference in some form in every aspect of political and economic life, and outright intervention when things aren't going the way that U.S. interests have wanted them to go. And this goes back really to about 1904, after Teddy Roosevelt declared that the U.S. had the responsibility, the power, the right, and the responsibility to act as a policeman for the Americas. And so that's 1904. That is an escalation of the Declaration of the Rights of the U.S. from the Monroe Doctrine that was much earlier, of course. But both of those things were the U.S. claiming its territory in Latin America and delineating its rights to do what it decided to do in Latin America. Now, in Honduras, there's really people may say, well, like, why? What was the interest in Honduras? And I think there's been two things from the beginning, and they continue to the present day. One is economic extraction of minerals through mining, bananas. The U.S., of course, had major banana companies that Standard and Vaccaro, which then became, I'm sorry, United, which then became Dole, and Vaccaro, which then became Chiquita. And so they had major power in the country with the banana industry. They also had other agricultural interests. So there's the economic. Control of a major port on the Caribbean side of Honduras was also important. The other is geopolitical. And where in the early days, that geopolitical power had to do with their rivals in Europe for the extraction out of Honduras. But very quickly that turned into geopolitical power to defend their interests against economic rivals and political rivals, with the beginning of their concerns over communism, over different kinds of revolutions in Latin America. And that starts in the 1930s. So the first coup that the US was involved in as an extreme source of intervention was in 1911 in Honduras. And it continued 1911, 1954, 1963, 1971. The US used its military might to defend both its geopolitical and its economic interests. And that's pretty much the story that's laid out as the beginning, the middle, and the end to date of the US relationship with Honduras. So I think when you look at that, how has it been carried out? It's been carried out through militarization is a theme that has to be recognized. The militarization of the Honduran military forces, arming, training, building bases, involving them in all kinds of partnerships, putting them in power with some of the coups, taking them out of power when it suited the US. But they've used militarization, using it to repress strikes, to repress different kinds of uprisings. Another aspect has been the political manipulation of, in 1981, just for example, in the midst of the US intervention in Central America, for which it used Honduras basically as a military base against the insurgencies in El Salvador and the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. It also decided that it should implement democracy in Honduras. So the United States rewrote the Constitution and decided that what it needed was a controlled democracy. And that starts in 1981. So as long as the democracy is controlled, then the US felt that that would increase stability for its economic exploitation and its geopolitical aims. And I think that's kind of the way we have to look at what the US is doing and why. The most important thing to understand Honduras today, the most important historical event now, I believe, is the 2009 coup d'etat. That was June 28th, 2009. And the reason I went back a little further was because this coup is a continuation of US policy and interference and intervention in Honduras. But at the same time, in order to understand why we're seeing thousands of refugees fleeing Honduras, why we're seeing increased violence, all kinds of violence in different levels, why we're seeing an ongoing and deepening crisis, the before and after event is the 2009 coup. And as people might remember, that was that took part after President Obama was elected. There was participation from the previous administrations, but it's another example of how throughout this history, Democrats and Republicans have pretty much maintained the same policy, a very similar policy. So the 2009 coup, the US faced a challenge from the controlled democracy of Honduras, from a president who wanted to make some changes, who saw himself as being allied with some of the experiments in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, even Brazil and Argentina, more independent-minded governments, some of whom consider themselves to be socialist. And President Manuel Zelaya was of that mind and began to exercise more sovereignty in his policy and his actions. So the 2009 coup took place, and in that moment, the US had an opportunity to change direction in Honduras. The coup was condemned worldwide as an obviously illegal coup, but the US in the end chose not to change directions. It actually did everything possible to keep Zelaya out of the country and to restore stability by legitimizing the coup through an election in 2009 that was held immediately post-coup and basically under military rule with soldiers in the streets. So that was a moment the US could have changed its history, but it did not. And since 2009, what's happened has been a deepening of crisis in every form. Assassinations, hundreds of Hondurans have been assassinated in political assassinations by military, death squads, police since 2009. The public institutions and governmental institutions have declined and become more corrupt than ever. The rule of law has been weakened to the point of being narrowly present, if at all. And most significantly, there's been an interweaving of the criminal, organized crime and narcotics traffickers, the political and economic elite, an interweaving so that it has become, in fact, a narco state. And this also, the US has had several chances to change that through when there were elections, and chose to continue to support an illegitimate government installed by military force and then by electoral fraud. So I think those are the key points that if we don't understand those things, we can't understand the crisis that we are seeing glimpses of only in the headlines in our country. So I would ask you to pay attention to this, and I think Elise is going to be talking about some of the work we're doing to change things, and I thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Vicky. You actually summarized 120 years in 10 minutes, so you did better than I expected. We have time for some questions now. The one thing I'd like to add, though, is I'm probably going to have to repeat the question for Vicky. So if you could make it concise, I think that would help. Go ahead.
Does the U.S. government continue to run the School of the Americas?
Vicky, the question is, does the U.S. government continue to run the School of the Americas at Fort Benning?
Well, they changed the name from the School of the Americas some years ago to the Western Hemispheric something or the other, WINSAC, but it's still the School of the Americas. And I believe they have been talking about eliminating the physical, like a school site at Fort Benning, but they continue, the key thing is they continue to train military from Colombia, from Honduras, from all these countries in the same classes and content that they always have.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, Vicky, I have one then. And has the U.S. through, say, the Agency for International Development or the World Bank played any role in contributing to the migration that exists today?
I think that, yes, it definitely has. And there's one way is, of course, through the programs of the World Bank and the IMF, and that may have made requirements on governments in Latin America. In order to get the money, you have to implement the economic procedures and policies that they believe are best. And this occurred in Honduras all during, especially the 80s, the 90s, and into the 2000s. So that's one thing. Austerity, privatization, attacks on the public sector, were all under those orders from those institutions. And the money was used as blackmail. The other thing is, while the US has come up at different times with packages under USAID of money that's supposed to go to alleviate violence, to help young people. Again, all of that money has been tied to whatever the interests of the US are, whatever they have decided will serve them best in keeping control of the country of Honduras in order to serve their economic and geopolitical. So I'm afraid even now this is an issue with President Biden. When Biden was vice president, he headed up a group. There was supposed to be a solution to the problems in Central America. Honduras was one of the key countries. And they came up with a plan to spend, I think it was $38 million. Now he's talking about a plan for a total of $4 billion. But again, under USAID and the other entities the US appoints to administer money, it's very unclear as to who gets the money, how they are decided upon to get the money, and then the question is, does that money go for things that actually address the root causes, if you even consider the root causes to be poverty, lack of opportunity, climate change? And there's really very little transparency. And in Honduras, because of the level of corruption and favoritism that's shown, the people of Honduras would tell you they don't see any of that money for anything that benefits them at all.
Well, thank you very much, Vicky. I think we're out of time for questions, so we'll move on.
Both of our next speakers are with Witness for Peace. And I've actually had the privilege of traveling with both of them to Honduras, which is one of our speakers' native country. She was born and grew up there. Maria Jose Mendez Gutierrez is the chair of the board of Witness for Peace Midwest. Elise Roberts is the national coordinator for Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective. And if you go on the Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective website, which I would encourage you to do if you haven't done that already, right there on the very, very first page, it says, "We are building transnational grassroots solidarity to resist violence, poverty, and oppression in the U.S. and Latin America." So right off the bat, we have something that challenges our narrative in terms of how the mainstream media reports what's going on in the world. It's not just about something that's happening far away, and particularly bad things happening away. All of the things that are reported have connections in every area of the world. There's a huge connection between the Enbridge Line 3 or even the Polymet mine and mining in Honduras and Guatemala. It's all part of the same global economic system. So our first of the two speakers is, as I said, Maria Jose Mendez Gutierrez. And she is at Harvard University at the moment, on the way to become a professor at the University of Toronto. She just finished her PhD at the University of Minnesota studying gangs, and I can hardly wait for her dissertation to be made into a user-friendly book that we can read and learn more about a very, very, very different narrative than we've heard about what it means to be a gang member in Central America. She's going to be talking about whatever she wants. I mean, she knows very well who we are. She knows obviously what's happening in Honduras, and she has some things to say that she thinks will be helpful to us as far as we understand what it means to change our narrative in terms of how we see Central America. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Professor Maria Jose Mendez Gutierrez.
Thank you, Tom, for that kind introduction. It's the first time that I give a talk, and I've been called a doctor because I had not been giving talks since I graduated. So that's very nice. I'm very happy to be here with you today, and thank you, Mayflower, and to St. Joan of Arc for this invitation. I want to pick up right where Vicky left off, and it's the issue of corruption. And that's at the risk of telling you a story that doesn't necessarily go against the narrative, right, of countries in the global south. We think of countries in the global south as corrupt, look at their governments, they steal a lot of money. So the first part of just what I'm going to share with you might reinforce a little bit of that, but, just keep listening because there's going to be a twist to that story. But we have to get a sense at least of that reality, right? Like what does it mean to say that Honduras is corrupt, and why does it matter to think about this corruption? So Honduras right now is ranked 146 has been ranked 146 out of 180 in terms of its corruption level, with as much as 13% of its GDP being lost to corruption, right? This is a number from 2018, so not that long ago. That's a lot of money, right, that is lost to corruption. And by corruption here, I really mean it's the misuse of public funds, it's illicit enrichment, it's public theft, it's abuse of authority. And the current government right now that is led by Juan Orlando Hernandez, and this is a name that you might have heard or not, but let me tell you just a little bit about him. He's a president who basically has been able to hold a grip on power. A lot of people in Honduras refer to him as the dictator, although in fact, right, he was democratically elected. But this is a government that really has used, all kinds of corruption schemes to stay in power. This is its second term. This was not constitutional, but this is a government that we have right now. And just to give you a sense of how deep this corruption is, I'll just illustrate it with an example, with a case that really illustrates this corruption. In between 2010 and 2014, there was a criminal network that was set up by the director of the Honduran Institute for Public Health. His name was Mario Zelaya, and he was a doctor, and he basically led this criminal network, and they embezzled about $300 million from this Institute of Public Health, and about 90 million of those 300 million that were stolen went to finance the campaign of the current president. And I've shared this story before. My mom is a doctor, and at the time she worked at a community clinic in a very basically one of the slums in Tegucigalpa, which is the capital city of Honduras. And when this was happening, right, they started noticing that there was just no medicine in the clinics, right, just absolutely no medicine. And it's not that Honduran clinics are well sourced, but they generally have enough pills, right, to treat preventable diseases. And what they did, she and other doctors basically had to look at their bank accounts, right, and their pockets to buy medicine or give money to the patients because there was just no medicine. In between that time when these funds were embezzled, about 3,000 people died. And this was just, for lack of medicines. It was so outrageous that they were giving out pills made out of flour, right, so adulterated medicine to sick people. Right, so this is, this is just how deep that corruption is. And Juan Orlando Hernandez, the current president, not only benefited from this, funds that were then diverted to fund his elections, he also has been connected to drug trafficking. So, here in the United States, there's been countless, a lot of people who have been brought to the United States and have been charged for drug trafficking, right? So there's U.S. court files that identify him as a co-conspirator in drug trafficking, that basically he employed the armed forces of Honduras to protect cocaine shipments and accepted bribes from drug trafficking organizations. And he's still the president. And the United States know this, and he's still there, right? but this government, I don't want us to just focus on this as a story of the present. I think as Vicky just gave us a wonderful context, right, for this corruption and also for U.S. involvement in Honduras. And this government, we have to think of it as only a tiny expression of how corruption became an operating system in Honduras since 2009. So in 2009, as she told us, there was a coup against democratically elected Manuel Zelaya. And, Manuel Zelaya did not only have progressive leanings for people on the ground, right? He represented an alternative. So he was associated with very progressive measures, for instance, the raising the minimum wage. He was in support of LGBTQ rights, for access to contraception pills. He defended a lot of indigenous movements that were reclaiming land. So he was doing, even though he had a very wealthy background and came from a very conservative family. In practice, he was extremely progressive, and the United States didn't like that, and also didn't like the fact that he was friends with Chavez and with other progressive, if you wish, like leaders in South America. Yeah, okay. I have 5 minutes, but I'll get to the US. This, and I don't want to just repeat Vicky, but this was a coup that was legitimized by the United States. Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State at that time, right? So this coup was legitimized by the US government. And it's not that there was a golden age before the 2009 in Honduras. Of course there were problems, but at least you had a sense that you could go to the court and you would have access to justice, or at least there was a semblance that the court system worked in some way, that you could express your rights, that you could demand your rights. There was also a sense that you could be, you could walk on the streets. At least, for me, like being a woman, like before 2009, I would walk in my neighborhood, no problem. After 2009, I started feeling a lot of fear, would not walk on the streets. And this was backed up by statistics, right? Like Honduras after 2009 saw a skyrocketing rate of femicides, of killings, right, of opposition leaders, of human rights defenders. And just to give you a sense how, just terrible this was, like from 2008 to 2011, the homicide rate increased by 50%. That's huge, right? So this coup was a very important event that just shifted what happened in Honduras afterwards. And it set the stage for this corruption that I started the presentation with. Now, what else does the U.S. have to do with all of this, right? The U.S. right now and, since 2009, basically ramped up its security aid to Honduras. So it increased exponentially. It meant that Honduran armed forces and police that were repressing human rights defenders, that were killing oppositional leaders, were getting more funding in terms of ammunition and in terms of training. And maybe just to wrap up, just the contradictions of the security aid, right? Because the security aid is meant to improve conditions in Honduras, or that's the narrative, right? That we're sending, or the United States is sending security aid to improve the conditions. So the police becomes less corrupt. Just a fact, like about 50% of the Honduran police is said to have links to organized crime. So this makes sense, right? You would send this money, you would send training to just improve these forces. The thing though is that, a lot of these security forces that are vetted by the United States, meaning that they're seen as forces that comply with human rights, not only participate in human rights violations, like have been known, to participate in the killings of land defenders. So I think maybe Elise will talk a little bit more about Berta and her case, right? But there's this confluence between U.S. trained security forces that have been linked to drug trafficking organizations, that have been linked to security forces that work on behalf also of transnational capital. And maybe just to really end, I'll give you an example. There's this agricultural company called the Grupo Dinant, and this company has been linked to the killings of about 100 campesinos or peasants in the Awan Valley in Honduras. It's an extremely fertile region. There's a huge land dispute, and the U.S. trained forces, so like one of the most elite forces in the country that has been vetted by the United States, has been trained by the United States, has been known to collaborate with the security forces of this company. And this company was owned by someone who is known as a drug trafficker. So you see the connections there. That's where this money is going, right? That's where this money is going. And so I think it's just important to think, when we're thinking of Honduras, when we're thinking of all of the problems in Honduras, right? That's real. All of this is real. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of violence. But we need to think of that in this geopolitical context, right? We need to understand the relationships between the United States and Honduras to be able to address the problems that are happening there. Otherwise, we're really being blind and just buying into this imperial narrative, right? That Honduras problems are just emanate from Honduras. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions or your comments, yes.
I think it was last spring, early in the spring, Vice President Harris traveled to Central America with the expressed intention of what we're discussing tonight. What are the reasons behind all the migration out? I've heard nothing what came out of that trip. You had an ear to the ground. What happened?
Well, a lot of rap songs that were criticizing Vice President Harris for one particular comment that she made, "Don't come." Right? There's actually a great Honduran rap song responding to that comment, right? Which precisely puts migration or the problem and the issue of migration in this context, like in this context of U.S.-Honduran relations and what that has to do with it, right? So what I would say is that nothing has fundamentally changed in terms of, for instance, the kind of programs that exist. So the Stay in Mexico program that was very much inaugurated during the Trump administration. That continues, or at least a version of that continues. So a lot of the hardline immigration policies that happened, that were promoted by the Trump administration, are still in place. So, I mean, nothing radical changed after that visit, right? Other than it was, to me and to a lot of Central Americans who heard that, it was just a confirmation of how little U.S. citizens and U.S. politicians understand the issue of migration. That it's not by saying to someone, "Don't come," that they're not going to come. That's actually a pretty banal statement to people, right, who are leaving this region for all kinds of reasons, right, economic and violence, etc. So but I wouldn't be able to answer your question in like very specific terms. I would just say that from what I gathered, is that what came out of it wasn't anything different from what had already been promoted by the previous administration. Yes.
Yeah. If I understood, Maria and I talked a little bit about our dissertation at one time, and if I understood, one of the things that you were trying to say in that dissertation was that out of these gangs that we see often here as horribly violent, and they are at times, but also some hope that there was, if I understood what you're saying, is that all of a sudden there seemed to be some solidarity with the land defenders and others that were pushing back against the government in Honduras, and the gangs actually took a day off from killing, sort of a day off of work, as you described it, to be part of that. Did I get it right? And if so, can you talk about that? Because that's hope from within Honduras. Did I get it right? Or
yeah. So maybe the way that I can maybe I'll answer that question via a question that was also posed to Vicky about U.S. aid and the kinds of prevention programs that have been set up in Honduras to address questions of violence, right? So, I mean, I probably want to leave time for Elise to be able to elaborate right on the act that we all want you to support. So happy to talk to you later also about what my dissertation is about. But one of the things that perhaps is important to think about is that if violence is a huge issue that is driving people out of the country, right? So Honduras has two big gangs that are rivals, that are very much linked to drug trafficking organizations, but also to the state, right? And that gets a little bit more complicated. That usually doesn't get told. And the way that the United States has been trying to address this issue of gang violence or of youth entering these gangs, right, that can be extremely violent in marginalized neighborhoods is through prevention programs, right? So it's kind of what you would find here in the United States, perhaps, right, with in Chicago or in LA. And this is, I mean, definitely a better approach than just killing them off, which is the approach, or like there's an extermination logic in Central America. Gangs, I think we forget oftentimes that they come from a lot of the same marginalized neighborhoods that people are migrating. Gang members who are leaving gangs are also migrating, right? Like this is a very like the people who are migrating, right, are not, we have this vision of the innocent migrant. Like we need to understand that, like these are very complex individuals that are leaving for all kinds of reasons. And so, these prevention programs like are meant to address violence. So basically it's like by incorporating them right into employment, etc. But I think from maybe the perspective even, of like Witness for Peace, trying to build solidarity, right? Like it's the idea that to be able to change the conditions in Honduras so that people don't leave and get to stay. People want to stay, right? People want to stay in their lands. But we have multinational companies, we have transnational capital, right? Like whether it's, like development projects funded by the World Bank, hydroelectric projects that are pushing people away from their lands. People like Berta, Caceres, people like, the communities that she supported. And so we need to find other ways, right? And the other ways are already in Honduras. The alternatives are already there. And it's people mobilizing in the same way that they mobilize here in the United States, right? Where like you see this confluence between Black Lives Matter and like indigenous politics, like that's happening in Honduras. But that's different from, I think, a more mainstream approach of reform. It's much more radical. That's why there's so much violence against these people, right? Who are trying to find other ways of building a country that, is free and I mean, these are the words of Berta, right? Like, I mean, free of the rapacious capitalism, like, like patriarchal structures and racism that just, that shapes the lives of so many people, right? So it's much the problem is much more fundamental, if you wish. And
thank you.
Yeah, sorry, that's a long-winded question it's a great question. It's just that we can continue that conversation later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, each of our speakers obviously could talk for several days on all of these issues, and so we're just getting a little bit of what each of them has to say. But what I think it should remind us is there are many of us in this room who are not full-time human rights activists. We don't know everything that's happening in Central America, and so but we care about global justice and we want to do the right thing. We want to be on the right side, and we need people like our speakers from Witness for Peace to provide us with the structural analysis that allows us to, in our faith tradition, what we call prophetic witness, to speak out and to speak the truth in love, especially to our elected leaders who are propagating some of these horrendous policies around the world. We just heard more about what we've been supporting in Honduras. Well, for me, for many years, Elise Roberts has been one of those people who gives generously of her time to come to places like this to help us with the structural analysis so that we can at least keep ourselves pointed in the right direction in terms of how we see global justice and what our voice should be in support of making the world a more just place. she and Witness for Peace are longtime partners of Mayflower, and we depend totally on her and them. And what you're going to hear from her now is a little bit of context about the two acts. You already heard from Maria Jose that we'll be asking you to support in just a few minutes. And she'll be giving some context of an act that's pending in the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate that directly would change what's happening in terms of U.S. foreign policy related to Honduras. So please join me in welcoming Elise Roberts.
Thank you, Tom. It's really nice to be here. It's been like a year and a half since I've been a Mayflower, and it feels like almost normal. I can't tell if you're smiling or scowling at me, but otherwise it feels good to be in person. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Berta Caceres Human Rights in Honduras Act. Berta's been referenced during this time. I don't know if you've heard of the work of Berta Caceres outside of this space, but she was a feminist, indigenous leader, a Lincoln leader who was assassinated in March 3rd of 2016. And she was one of those people who was such a leader, she was so connected to the movements around the entire country. She was one of the people who was connecting Lincoln struggles to Garifuna struggles, to LGBTQ struggles, to small-scale farming struggles. And her assassination just marked a whole different level of state violence. The idea that there could be impunity in an assassination of someone like Berta just was mind-blowing. You know, that somebody of that magnitude and respect around the country. So it provided this moment to introduce legislation that her case is kind of an emblematic piece of. But the legislation, partially because it's based off of Berta and her analysis of what justice would look like, it really isn't, we couldn't start from a point that justice looks like, you know, catching the people who assassinated her. It had to start from telling the truth in a bigger picture way, of stopping the systems that allowed this to happen, and of making reparations and addressing the harm that had been caused. So one of the goals of the Berta Caceres Act from the beginning was in ensuring that it provided the intersectional lens that kind of broadened what was happening beyond this attack on this one amazing woman, this one Lincoln movement. And so the Berta Caceres Act always includes cases of Garifuna, Black indigenous leaders who have been assassinated by the state, by journalists and lawyers, of LGBTQ leaders, of the hundreds of small-scale farmers we were talking about in the Iguan. And the bill calls for a complete, immediate suspension of all U.S. security aid and training to Honduras until there are drastic changes in the human rights situation there. That looks at both changes in the militarization of the police. It calls for justice in all of these emblematic cases that I've referenced, and it calls for a stop of all of the security and training aid until there are changes in those structures. So that's really exciting. It was really exciting when that was introduced. We have built up, I think there were now 260 some co-sponsoring organizations from, you know, the AFL, the Steelworkers, the Unitarians, the UCC churches, the Sierra Club, just the scope of people who see their struggles in this legislation is really clear. So that's one thing that's really important. The bill this year is called H.R. 1574. It currently has 62 co-sponsors in Congress. And what was exciting this year was there was parallel legislation introduced in the Senate. It was introduced by Senator Merkley and immediately had about 11 other senators sign on. Neither of our senators are on boards. That's definitely one of the main asks here, is get them to support the Honduras Anti-Corruption and Human Rights Act, which is the parallel bill in the Senate. So I'm just going to step back for 1 minute and put those two things within a little bit more framing. How much time do I have? 7 minutes? That's great. Okay. So next week, we're going to be coming out with what's called a Dear Colleague letter calling on justice for specific attacks on Ofrane, which is the Garifuna community in Honduras. Those include a lack of implementation of inter-American court decisions. So where the inter-American court has made a judgment that they have won and the Honduran government is refusing to enforce it, refusing to take the actions that have called upon by the international community. They also had a number of Griffin leaders who were disappeared. There's been clear connections to U.S. funding for the military that disappeared them and most likely murdered them. And so we're doing this Dear Colleague letter to call for an independent investigation in the disappearances and to call for them to actually enact these inter-American court cases, right? That's the type of thing that we have to do all the time in every country, whenever there's, for every mine, for every case, because there isn't the broader policy solution, right? So we're still going to keep doing that because until there is a broader policy solution, we need to be fighting for every case, every mine, every situation that comes up. So, but it is really exciting that we've gotten to a point where there is this landmark legislation that would be a structural, systematic change. We're not supporting any of this and any of the future cases that would happen like this until there are major shifts. Somehow this is a Democratic issue, but that's confusing to me. I don't know how any of us would want our money spent on supporting a corrupt regime and governments that are displacing people. But I really think it's something that everyone should be able to get on. If it's not because you care about human rights, it's because you care about Pentagon waste or big government or some other reason why we shouldn't be giving our taxpayer money to corrupt governments. I'll also say on the flip side of that is that we've been in the process of supporting two other pieces of legislation, one of which was introduced by our very own Congresswoman Omar here in Minneapolis. It's called the Stop Arming Human Rights Offenders Act, or Stop Arming Human Rights Abusers Act. And this is legislation that could be applied in every country in the whole world. So we have to do things country by country, regime by regime. A new president comes in and we'd have to start all over again documenting what they'd done. But this is legislation that would mean that it would be implemented as soon as a government that received U.S. security aid was committing human rights violations against their people. The security aid would be immediately cut. There's also a bill about to be introduced called the Chicxoy Dam International Accountability Act. This is based on a massacre in Guatemala in the late 80s, and Witness for Peace was one of the ones there documenting in Guatemala what happened then. And this little notebook that we wrote together about some of the documentation, led by the 30 years of courageous defense of the people affected by the Chicxoy Dam, are about to introduce this bill now, which would call for automatic reparations, human rights and environmental reparations tied to all U.S. Bank and International Development Fund projects. So the same sort of thing that would mean that if we're developing anywhere and we're investing in a project anywhere, it would be automatically tied to addressing any sort of harm, environmental or human rights harm. And for me, so that's exciting. There are all these different levels. So when we think about the Berta Caceres Act, this is justice around security right now in Honduras, which is critical. And all these things that are happening case by case are critical, and then coming up with more structural solutions is what we're really looking for. I'll also just say that one of the fundamental narrative things about this that always confuses me is security aid is always tied to development aid. Like when you think about a development project, we're putting in a dam, we're putting in a hydroelectric plant, we're putting in, a school. It's always about 30 or 40% security aid, which doesn't make any sense to me. Like if the people want it, if you're providing development for the people, things that they want, then you don't need the security to protect your project from the people. It just doesn't make any sense. There shouldn't be a security need. So in the Berta Caceres Act and these other bills that we're talking about, I would get back to one of the questions around U.S. aid and the effects of World Bank. I think it is all problematic. I think that any money going to Honduras right now is not going to be serving the people if it's coming from the U.S. government. That's just the structure. But this bill is just about the security piece. And it seems like at the very least we can get on the same page about that. Because it doesn't make any sense that you would need a militarized riot force to get forward anything that the people of a country were calling for. That's what I got to say. Yep.
So if we go out on your website, can we see the House and Senate file numbers of this legislation that you're advocating?
That's right. Yeah. So it's solidaritycollective.org. And there is an actual link there. I don't know if you could pull it. Could you pull it up? solidaritycollective.org, and there's a section called the Berta Caceres Act. You can sign up you can support it as an organizational endorsement if you're part of an organization, a union, a faith community. You can, Berta Caceres Act, right? First thing there. It lists all the representatives who are on board, all the senators who are on board. We actually have specific different links that you can send to different, depending on who your person is. It's also just worth saying in this local crowd, Representative McCollum has always been a supporter of this. She is currently not on the bill this year, and that's because she's holding a specific leadership position in appropriations. That means that it might come across her desk. So that's why she's not signing it. She is still supporting it, but she's just at one of those positions where it might come across her desk where she doesn't want to be previously on one side of it, but she's still needs to be thanked for her leadership and told how important it is that she's on the right side of it. But just so if she's a representative and you see her name there, don't think she's gone to the other side. She's just in an important position right now. Any other questions? Yeah.
What about the other representatives?
The other representatives?
Yes, where are they on this?
Representative Craig is supporting it. Angie Craig. Yeah, Representative Omar is on it. Dean Phillips is not on it. I ran into Dean Phillips in the House of Representatives with Berta's daughter, and talked to him about it. So he knows the reference, but he hasn't gotten on it. Are there other people I'm forgetting? Neither of the senators are on it.
Why not?
I mean, it'd be a good question for them. Maybe they haven't heard the right narrative from all of us. Yeah, I don't really think there's a whole lot of political risk of being on it, honestly. I don't understand. Like I said, I don't. This is serving huge corporations, and it's serving certain types of military investors and that sort of thing. But I think that it's kind of one of those traps that you fall into. If you're looking at people are poor, they probably need more jobs. They probably need jobs from a Four Seasons resort because that's more sustainable than the fishery they're working with or whatever. Just this logic of what is going to help people when that's not what anybody's asking for, when those things are actually violently displacing people. I think it's the same sort of thing where you're the courts are corrupt and you think, we should support the courts. And it's well, we're giving money to corrupt courts, and it's not the structural change that we're looking for. I'm actually going to add one quick thing because I had somebody ask me to speak to the elections. So just really briefly, why this moment, we're in October 2021, why is it important right now? There are a couple just really brief things. One is there's an presidential election coming up in November, the end of November. And it's one of those moments where we can lose a lot of momentum, where somebody else who's another very similar leader, somebody else who's going to do the exact same things, it's another person at the top of a whole structure is changed. And it's a time where they can be well, let's give that person a chance. And they haven't committed all these human rights violations. And when that happens every 4 years, we're never going to make any change with the way that Congress works. We need to keep up the pressure that it is not about this one individual, that no individual president that could be elected through the Honduran system right now is on the side of the Honduran people. And so that's we're just at a point of vulnerability in terms of our messaging and making it really clear that, yes, Juan Orlando has been horrible, and it's not just him. The other thing is the Berta Caceres verdicts, which those of you who follow the case, there was just a lot of excitement that David Castillo was convicted, and he was listed as one of the intellectual authors of the case. The hitmen have already been convicted a few years ago. But it's one of those moments also where we can be oh, look, the Honduran government is having justice. Look, the courts are working. They're putting him in jail. And what's really important is that David Castillo is the person that was between the state forces and the hitmen. So like he's the person who knows all of the other people. He's not the intellectual author. He's the person that can give us all of that information. And so like it's like we're just at that point of being like, okay, we're calling for more justice. Who were the people who actually called for this assassination? Who were the structural leaders who called for it? And it's the same sort of thing. We're at a vulnerable point in terms of the messaging, in terms of the clarity, in terms of the narrative of this is not a success of the Honduran court systems. This actually exposes the level of corruption. It exposes the level of depth of state violence and corruption. And it can be spun a different way, so. You're gonna give me my stop sign? Which sign are you giving me? It's the stop sign, okay. It's really nice to be with you all. I could follow up a little bit if there are other questions, so thank you.
So, do I have any volunteers in terms of, what you've learned or what surprised you and may have even changed your thinking tonight from anybody? We've only got a minute or two, so. So let's see, who's oh, there's one up there.
Yeah, we talked at the beginning and we talked about how our field group before had kind of known the general history and the situation in these areas, in these Central America. And then something we didn't know and that we kind of learned that was a bit more optimistic and hopeful was some of the actions and the bills that are currently happening, like we Elise talked about at the end here. We didn't know that was something that was being done, and I feel like a lot of times in the news and mainstream conversations, it's more focused on what has happened and past, and rather than what is currently happening and what positive outcomes are happening.
Okay, well, thank you. In terms of the two bills, Elise is still here. Elise, is it too much of a generalization to say that the difference between the two bills is that the Berta Caceres Act curtails the security aid, and the Merkley bill, the Senate version, kind of curtails the direct sale of weapons to Central America?
Yeah, so basically the Berta Caceres Act is fully included within the Senate legislation and the Schakowsky bill, both versions of the Anti-Corruption and Human Rights bill. They include everything from the Berta Caceres Act, so a complete suspension of military aid until the exact same cases are handled, the exact same language. It also includes money for the Special Prosecutor's Office in Honduras. It includes support for a anti-corruption program similar to one used called the CICIG in Guatemala. It includes the sales, which is a huge loophole in the Berta Caceres Act. That's great. We have to cut sales too if we're cutting aid. And support for the UN Human Rights Office on Honduras. So kind of some things that are not like we're entirely disengaging, but we still want to support, human rights and anti-corruption work through these other international organizations.
Okay, well, thanks. Do we still have time for one more short question if anybody has any feedback? Okay. Tom?
Okay, we just have a few minutes left, and you should have a sheet of paper now that says on the top, next steps. And one of my pet peeves in the whole entire world, which you don't necessarily need to hear about a lot of my pet peeves, but the whining when people say, "What can I do? There's nothing I can do." That is just never true. You can always do something. And in terms of response to many of the things we heard tonight, we have some suggestions as to what you can do. This event tonight actually came out of several visits with Senator Klobuchar's staff, Senator Smith's staff, and Representative Phillips' staff in terms of asking them to support these acts. And part of what we want to do is add your signatures to some letters to show them that it's not just 5 or 6 of us, that there actually are people in communities around Minnesota who want them to support the act. So in addition to the next steps page that you have, you also should have the text of the letter that we're asking you to sign, so that you're not just signing it blindly without having read it. Hopefully you've got that by now. And I'm going to quick read it just so it's all in our minds. Dear Minnesota Congressional Delegation, we are members and friends of St. Joan of Arc Catholic Church in Minneapolis, Mayflower United Church of Christ in Minneapolis, other faith-based organizations, and others committed to a world of peace and justice. We are committed to democracies that honor every person's dignity. The U.S. government is deeply complicit in the devastating situation of repression, crime, corruption, and impunity in Honduras. We are deeply concerned about the continued U.S. support for the government of Honduras that preys on its own people to ensure profit for transnational corporations. You must pass H.R. 1574, the Berta Caceres Human Rights in Honduras Act, and S. 388, the Honduras Human Rights and Anti-Corruption Act of 2021. U.S. foreign policy has killed Berta Caceres and hundreds more since the 2009 coup in Honduras. The two acts would suspend United States security assistance to Honduras until such time as human rights violations by Honduran security forces cease and their perpetrators are brought to justice. So far, only Representatives Omar and Craig are co-sponsoring the act that is pending before their body. A big thanks to them. The rest of you are uniquely situated to assist the people of Honduras who for decades have been repressed by an army and police force directly supported by U.S. aid. We are counting on you to act to open the democratic space in Honduras and stop the repression. For more information, please contact Joe McConney from St. Joan or Tom Haynes from Mayflower. Thank you very much. So there are 5 copies of that letter on the back table. There are pens connected to every one of those, and we're asking you to please sign one of the copies of that letter. What else can we do? Well, we can donate to organizations who are doing all of this work on the ground to give us the structural analysis that we need to do our prophetic witness. On the sheet is the website for Witness for Peace and also for Honduras Solidarity Network. And if you gave us your email anywhere along the line, either by registering or when you signed up at the door when you came in, we will send you an electronic version of these next steps also, so you can just click on the link so you don't have to type the whole thing in. I think that giving money and investing in justice organizations is a very underappreciated way that we can take action. So if you think there's nothing I can do, you can always write a check. Tonight, I would suggest you write a check or credit card donation, whatever you want to do, to the sources of our speakers for tonight, the Honduras Solidarity Network, and also Witness for Peace. What else can we do? You can go to Honduras. That's what you can do with Witness for Peace. They also sponsor delegations to other places, and you can check that out on their website. Those are, I think many of us here have been there and can attest to the fact that going to countries like Honduras, Guatemala, those are life-changing experiences, and it's not nearly as easy anymore to be lied to once we've actually been on the ground and sat and listened at the U.S. Embassy and listened to their lies coming out of their mouths, frankly. So sign up for a Witness for Peace delegation. You can also join the St. Joan of Arc Welcome the Stranger team. There's a sign-up sheet on the other table, and if you want somebody to call you and talk to you about what it might mean for you to be part of that group, you can join the Mayflower Global Justice Advocacy team. There's a sign-up sheet for that. And you can, for sure, in addition to signing the letter, call your congressional representatives, call your United States senators, and tell them that you are very much in favor of them supporting the acts that you've heard of tonight. You can also learn more if you want to learn something about Honduras. You can go on the Witness for Peace website. It has all kinds of things. You can also read a book, The Long Honduran Night by Dana Frank is an excellent book that talks about not only what's happening there, but also U.S. complicity. We're people of faith. We can pray for Central America, for activists who are working for justice. And you can also keep in touch with networks that will keep you abreast of news in Central America. You can sign up to receive emails from Witness for Peace, Honduras Solidarity Network, and other Mayflower partners, Rights Action, who has connections in Honduras as well as Guatemala. So all kinds of options for you, but the one that's on the top of the list, very much on purpose, is to sign your name on those letters that are on the back table as soon as we finish with the evening, which is coming up right now because it's time for our closing.
Thanks everyone for sharing this evening with us. We've been looking forward to this time for a long time. We've been planning for weeks. We're really glad that you came to learn more about what's actually happening on the ground in Honduras and Central America in general. Thank you especially to Majo, Elise, and Abstentia, and Vicky. We're so glad that you were willing to be a part of this to really help us understand more in a deeper way what's happening and what we can do to be a part of making a difference. In a minute, we're going to close from words with Joan Chittister and the Talmud. Please stop at a table in the back on the way out to sign that letter, and also to sign up for any of those committees Tom was telling you about, especially sign up for a delegation to go to Honduras.
Hey Diane, can I ask for everybody to just wave to Vicky? She would like to see everyone that she was with tonight. Everybody say hi. Hi. So great that she's with us.
Vicki, we were glad you were with us tonight. Okay, now, some words, please, from Joan Chittister, who dedicates her book, The Time Is Now, to the following. Everywhere there are people who, despite finding themselves mired in periods of national darkness or personal marginalization, refuse to give up the thought of a better future or give in to allurements of a deteriorating present. They never lose hope that the values they learned in the best of times, or the courage it takes to reclaim their world from the worst of times, are worth the commitment of their lives. These people, the best of ourselves, are legion, and they are everywhere. It is the unwavering faith, the open hearts, and the piercing courage of people from every level of every society that carries us through every major social breakdown to the emergence again of the humanization of humanity. In every region, everywhere, there are the unsung but mighty voices of community, high-mindedness, and deep resolve. They are the prophets of each era who prod the rest of the world into seeing newly what it means to be fully alive, personally, nationally, and spiritually. And finally, from the Talmud, do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justice now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You're not obliged to complete the work, but neither are you allowed to abandon it. Go in peace, knowing that we're doing this work together, and that we all have a part, and we do make a difference. Thanks for coming.